Okay, so today we're just going to talk about crankbaits for a little bit. As you can see, these aren't very many, but I've got my share of crankbaits. So we're going to talk about plastic crankbaits today. So one of the things I want to show you about the fishing line. This is regular monofilament, 12-pound test. See it right there. This right here is what you need to look for. This is the most important thing. See that right there, that 0.014 average diameter? That's more important than the pound test, believe it or not. The pound test is supposed to be the breaking strength. Here's the thing about Trilene Big Game. Trilene Big Game, the actual breaking strength is more than the 12-pound test, but it's because it's a thicker line. Okay, so this line is what I use more than anything to crank with for years before I even understood the diameter of line, because I used to use 10-pound test Big Game just because it was inexpensive, easy to get to, and kind of before fluorocarbon was a big thing. It was pretty common for everybody to throw monofilament. Well, what I realized is that that's the line that the 10-pound test just snapped too easy. This one would break also, but it was a little harder for the fish to break, especially after I learned and spent time learning how to set my drag and everything else. But when I started using fluorocarbon line, I automatically went to 12-pound test, and around those rocks and stuff, sometimes they would eat me up a lot. Well, I happened to be out there one day and I didn't have a choice because the reel that I was using that 12-pound line on kind of backlashed and messed up on me. So the only other one I already had a jig tied on, and it was 15-pound test. So the 15-pound test is what I started throwing, and I realized that, man, I'm still catching fish on these crankbaits, and I'm doing great. I mean, they're hitting it just as good as they was on that 12. And I was like, that's pretty amazing because this is thicker line. Well, what I realized is that diameter, there's 15-pound test, diameter is 0.013. So it's not much to our eyes, but honestly, 15-pound test Seaguar is thinner than that line right there is. So this is why this line right here is what I've started to use on just about everything. I use on spinnerbait, I use a 20, just because, I mean, I have for years. 15-pound is what I use on my finesse jigs, 15-pound is what I use on my jerk baits, and 15-pound is what I used on most of my crankbaits. So I just wanted to show you that comparison between the two. So now that we've covered the fishing line, I'm kind of going to show you a little bit. So we're going to make this little video here about the regular crankbaits. I'm going to try to divide this up into two videos because it's just a lot to cover. Not going to cover everything. I'm not the best crank fisherman in the world. I'm not a professional. I'm just going to tell you my experiences and go from there. So first off, we're going to talk about just regular crankbaits. I'll make another little video about balsa crankbaits. Okay. So right off the bat, probably the crankbait that got me started on crankbaits was this little fella here, Bandit 200. It was probably one of the first crankbaits, either this or the 100, I'm going to say, that I really started throwing crankbaits, and I'm not including when I used to throw with my dad, the Rapala. We used to throw it out, twitch it a couple times. I'm talking about actually picking up a literal little plastic crankbait and throwing it with the purpose of banging around rocks and doing things with it. I had a gentleman that taught me how to throw these and taught me, you know, different places to use them. Right off the bat, used to do what everybody did. Used to throw it on 10-pound line, and learned very quickly that 10-pound line was too small a line for me, because I was catching pretty good sized fish and I lost a couple crankbaits right off the bat. So I started using heavier line, believe it or not, just because I didn't want to lose my baits. So I started throwing that 12-pound monofilament, and then later on I kind of wound up where I am now, to where I throw 15-pound Seaguar, that Red Label, with pretty much every crankbait I have. And I know everybody's choice is different lines they use. It's what I use. I'm successful with it. That's what I do. The Little Bandit 100, 200 goes about 6-7 foot deep. On that 15-pound line, it may get down to about 6 feet. I've never really measured it. I know it gets to where I need it to. It bounces on the rocks that I need it to, and it does just fine. This is probably one of the baits that was the first fish that I ever caught in the wintertime on a crankbait, was on a Bandit. 200, and then probably the first smallmouth in the wintertime that I ever caught years ago was a 300. A buddy of mine went and fished a big tournament on Cumberland years ago. Wind was blowing a lot, and we couldn't get a bite on anything else. We had ran all the way to the other end of the lake, come back, stopped at a couple points. I picked up a Bandit 300 and made a couple casts and caught three little bitty fish, and that's what keyed me into, wow, they'll hit that crankbait. I'd throw the jig and drag the shaky and done all this other stuff, and I realized, wow, they'll hit a crankbait in the middle of wintertime. So that's pretty much what got me throwing crankbaits in the winter. Then over the years, I learned a little bit about rattle trap. Rattle trap, yo-yoing a lot, doing different things. I've caught fish, same thing, between 40 degrees all the way up. I've caught probably one of my biggest largemouths out of one of these little local lakes. I'm gonna say probably in years, it was probably 6+ on a red rattle trap right in the middle of summertime. All I was doing was just casting right out in the middle, and I was just side yo-yoing it. I wasn't even yo-yoing it up and down. I was just side yo-yoing it, kind of like you would with a jerk bait. I was reeling, all of a sudden it loaded up, and when I got that fish in, it was a pretty good sized fish. So what I learned was, and this is something that I'm gonna try my best to get across, is that I used to love throwing a jig a lot. I used to love throwing spinnerbait. But I learned in a lot of these pressured lakes that spinnerbait wasn't always gonna get bit. I learned that if I wanted to catch fish, then I had to do things different than what I was doing. It weren't always gonna go out and get the perfect bite, you know, because the more I fished, I realized, man, I went fishing all day today and I didn't get a bite. I went fishing all day today and caught 2 fish. I said, man, there's got to be ways to catch these fish. And I kept fishing at the same little small lake, you know, and I started reading magazines back then, and you had online, but you really didn't have YouTube like you do now. So I started reading and watching a lot of these guys on these tournaments to how they were using square bills. And they were taking these square bills and they were throwing them up in trees and banging them around, bringing them out. I've watched a couple of Rick Clunn videos, you know, that he was talking about how he would go up and down a bank, and if he caught a few fish with one bait, he would come back down through that same bank with a different tile bait. So I decided that I was going to get me a couple of those square bills. And when I went to the bait shop, my first experience with the square bill, which this isn't one of them, but this is one that's painted a lot like it, was the Lucky Craft Rick Clunn purple and chartreuse. That was one of my first crankbaits that I bought. I bought it, and I bought that copper perch, and I think I bought one that had a white, like a green copper back. They were in the 1.5 model. I learned quickly when I threw it on 10-pound line and I had a fish break me off that I probably needed to step it up. And the only other rod that I had with me had that 12-pound line on. So I put it on it. It was a happy medium. I threw it on 15-pound mono a couple times because it was a $20 crankbait at the time. So I decided that I preferred it on that 12-pound monofilament, big game, because it seemed like I got the most bites when I had it on that line. Caught quite a few fish on it. Caught really nice fish on it. In the winter time, it would get muddy at that little lake a lot when I was fishing that little lake, and I would catch some absolutely just, I mean, I would go down the banks and I would catch, we're talking about 3 to 4 pound largemouths. Back then, it was very easily to catch one of them when you go down the bank. Not everybody talked about catching them. Not everybody caught them. But I realized that I had something special in my hand, because that crankbait, I was throwing it a little different. I was doing what they were talking about in those videos. I wasn't just throwing it out in open water and bringing it back to me. I was letting it bang around in those trees. I was specifically fishing it in brush piles. I was banging it against logs that I saw. I was throwing it on little dips in the water that I could tell that the water was maybe 2 foot deep back in these little shallows, but here this 5 foot diver was kind of grinding. I would reel it a little bit and stop it, reel it a little bit and stop it. So that bait was just kind of digging around, and they would, nail it. There was times that I would throw it out and I would use it like a topwater bait, because I would throw it out and the fish would nail it as soon as it hit the top of the water. So I was like, well, I wonder if they'll hit it like that. So I would throw it out and I would twitch that rod where that bait would just go down and float up, kind of like we used to do the old repellers. Guess what? It caught fish. So it became probably one of the #1 crankbaits that I threw all the time. But then, just like every other crankbait, came days that didn't get bites. And I thought, well, maybe they've just gotten conditioned. That's what you hear. They've gotten conditioned to the bait. I just need to find me a new crankbait. So you go through this never-ending, I got to find me a different crankbait. Well, over the years, one of the other crankbaits that everybody talked about when I started bass fishing again, everybody talked about the old rock crawler. It goes about 13, 14 foot down on 12-pound fluorocarbon. It's the best thing that's ever been, especially on Cumberland. Well, there's nothing like it. Sure enough, the first day or two I took it out to Cumberland, I wound up catching about 3.5, 4 pound smallmouth on it. The only fish I caught all day, but the friend that was with me, he didn't catch any fish that day either. So that was the only thing that caught me fish that day, was that rock crawl. Then kept spending more time fishing it. Threw it in clear water, didn't even think about it because I didn't have very much experience in clear water. Threw it in clear water, did okay with it, would catch fish early in the morning, in the afternoon wouldn't catch them. Always made sure I was grinding it on the bottom. I learned pretty quickly that the old rock crawler wasn't always the case either. So what was the deal? What was the big secret? I talked to a couple buddies at a bait shop, and I was like, man, if you had one crankbait, what would be your favorite? Well, they talked about the Spro Little John 50. How that bait was the best thing that ever was. It was their favorite crankbait in the springtime. So I was like, I'm gonna buy me a couple of them. Sure enough, I took it to that little lake. Then I go to one of the 2 little lakes that I go to. I threw it. Sure, I caught fish. But then the day came again where I threw it all day long, didn't get a bite. I even threw this one in the wintertime. Caught fish on it. The winter that I threw, the first winter that I had the rock crawler, I'm like, man, I'm set. I'm gonna throw this in the winter and still catch fish. Well, this little bait here was grinding on the bottom, no fish. So I'm like, wonder what the deal is. They should be dragging on the bottom. That's what everybody talks about. Well, I happen to have I took that bait off because after throwing it for 2 hours and not getting a bite, and it's about 40 degrees outside, you want to catch a fish. So I was like, I'm gonna put that other little bait on. I'll do a little bit better with it. So I put it on. I put this little one on right here. Not this color, but I put this on. It doesn't go as deep. Still throw it in the same depth. Banging it around the rocks coming out, you know. So I said, well, let's just see. Caught a few fish on it. I was like, wow. Well, today must have been the day for this bait, not for this bait. Well, then I got to a little lake. I went to the lake one morning, early in the morning, and I had made up this little bait that only runs about a foot or so. Caught a couple fish on top. Then all of a sudden the bite quit. And what did I do? Then all of a sudden my little wheels in my head started clicking one day. And I started realizing that, you know what? I just wonder if the reason why they ain't hitting those baits is because they're not at the depth that those baits are at. I need to start paying attention more about what depth these fish are. I need to start paying attention more about the action they have. Well, the day that I started doing that, I started catching a whole lot more fish on a crankbait. When I stopped looking at crankbaits as I'm going to throw my favorite crankbait today, and I started looking at crankbaits as tools, I started being more successful. When I started thinking about, there's a shallow little grass flat over there, water's about this deep before it hits the grass, but I'm pretty sure there's fish over there. I need to throw this little shallow one over there, see if I can get a bite. I'd catch a few fish. Then when I'd go through and I'd say, you know what, it's about 15 foot deep here, and looks to me like on the depth finder, most of the fish are on the bottom. I haven't caught nothing on top all day. I wonder if those fish are on the bottom. Then I started throwing this little rock crawler and banging around out there deep. I started catching fish. Early in the morning, instead of throwing top water, when I wanted to cover water along the bank and get around those logs, everything that was 5 foot or less, on a nice rainy day, when I started throwing this little square bill up around those, I started getting bit. I started catching fish. That, I think, a lot of times is the reason why we're not successful with crankbaits. A lot of times we want to try to get fish to bite what we want to throw. The truth is, crankbaits, we need to use them if we really want to be successful. We need to use crankbaits to fish the situations that we're in. If you want to throw a top water, you don't drag a jig. You know they're hitting on top, you throw a top water. Crankbaits, if you break them down, they're the same thing. Everybody wants to point to one specific one and say, well, that's the best one to use. That's the one you use all the time. It may work today. That don't mean it's going to work tomorrow. Guess what? If they're feeding on shad on the top, you can throw the best, the most expensive, the most hand-painted rock crawler you want ever. You're probably not going to get a bite on it, because most of those fish aren't looking on the bottom, they're looking up top. But if you go back through that same section, and it's about 15 foot deep, and you start throwing this little MD right here, or even the smaller one that has a little small lip, and running it across in that 5-6 foot, you'll probably catch fish on it. Just like I did the other day. I was throwing this right here in some of the deepest cover. You could see about 7 foot down. And I could see those trees. You could see it coming out of the trees to get it. Guess what? They were hitting it just fine in that clear water. I was staying on shady banks, but they were hitting it just fine. That's my advice when you're going out and throwing crankbaits. Take your crankbaits and rig them up and set them up just like you would rigging up your spinnerbait, your shaky heads, your top waters. Use crankbaits individually as tools. You look at some of the pros, what they talk about. They talk about they'll take one crankbait and change the line size and have 2 or 3 different line sizes. They'll have 10-pound tests, they'll have 15-pound tests, they'll have 20-pound tests on the same crankbait. And there's people out here that say, they have all these different ideas. Truth is those guys, that's what they do. And a lot of them are very successful doing that. Why? Because they're adjusting the depth of that bait. Me personally, I'm not going to throw a 5XD all day long. I'm just not going to wear myself out doing it. Anybody who wants to, that's awesome. I'm not going to. I'm also not going to throw a 3/4 ounce jig. I did it for a while. It was okay. It's too heavy on my shoulder. It wears me out. I'm also not going to throw a 3/4 ounce and a half spinnerbait like I used to anymore. I'm just not. I'm going to throw a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait, and I'm going to go down the bank, and I'm going to use the crankbaits and my top water and my shaky head. If fish are real deep, I like that drop shot. Catches a lot of fish for me. I'm happy with the fish that I catch. Crankbaits, in order to be successful with them, like I said, a lot of people have been asking me questions. That's the mindset that I have with crankbaits anymore. Okay? Do I have a few that are my favorites? Yes, I do. Personally, out of these ones that I just showed you, I like that little John right there. If the water is clear or if the water is cold. I like that little bait there because it's a little flat bait. I've got another one that I've been trying that this year I'm going to spend a little bit of time with. It's kind of new to me. I'm not going to mention it until I catch some fish on it. That's probably out of all those baits right there, other than that little top water one. Do I catch a lot of fish on it? No, but to me it's neat watching them come up and grab it off the top. So that little bomber right there is one of them. All the baits are fun to use though. All the crankbaits are fun to use, but they're all tools designed to do different things. Anyway, hope this helps you. Hope it blesses you. Like I said, I'm gonna do another little series and we're gonna talk a little bit about balsa crankbaits. That's gonna be in another little video. Anyway, hope this helps you. If you have any questions, message me. God bless you all. Don't forget, Jesus loves you. Y'all have a blessed day.